So my introduction to this field came with this chap. So this is Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, and he invented what's known as DNA fingerprinting, which is essentially a way of being able to tell people apart from one another using their DNA. And people, when they think about DNA fingerprinting, what they usually think of is, you know, flashing sirens and forensics and this kind of thing. But actually the first time it was ever used was in an immigration case, a little mini genetic genealogy case. So this case is started with this woman here. So this is Christiana, and she was living here in London. She was a nurse. She was here with 3 of her children. And this is her son, Andrew, who had been back in Ghana, and he'd been visiting her estranged husband, his father. He comes back into this country, and the people don't believe that he's actually her son. So they are putting this case together. And one day their caseworker is sitting on the bus one morning and looks down at the newspaper and sees about this new sort of invention, DNA fingerprinting. And so she contacts Alec with some trepidation and says, you know, would you help with this? And so he decides to take it on. And he is able to solve this case for her. So what you've got here, these are DNA fingerprints. I'm not going to go into the masses about the science of this. These are DNA fingerprints. So each row is a DNA fingerprint of somebody. And those little black blobs, they're known as bands, they are where you get genetic variation between people. So what they did was they got the DNA fingerprint of the mother and of Andrew and of her 3 other children. Now, because you share half of your DNA with each of your parents, you'd expect half of these bands to be shared across if Andrew was her son, and across with the siblings as well. And that was the case. And that was in 1985. We're talking well over 30 years ago. And with everything that DNA fingerprinting has ever been used for, Alec will tell you that this is the case. He is still the one that he's most proud of. The next time it was used was in a forensic case. So these are the Narborough Enderby murders. 1983, Dawn Ashworth, sadly raped and murdered, 1983 Linda, and then 1986 you've got Dawn. So she is raped and murdered as well. These are little villages just outside of Leicester. And a chap called Richard Buckland confesses that he killed Dawn. Now, David Baker, who's the chief constable at the time, he's pretty sure that the same person has done both of those. So he goes to Alec and says, look, can you do the DNA fingerprinting? I need you to show that it's the same person who's done both of these. And apparently Alec does the work, rings back late one night and says, I've got good news and bad news. So the bad news is you've got the wrong person in jail. The DNA shows he can't have done this. The good news is we now have the DNA fingerprint of the killer. So what they do is they do a DNA dragnet. So this is where they go out to the 3 villages and they encourage men from a particular age group to come in and do blood samples, and they do DNA fingerprinting on them. Now, the real killer is this chap, Colin Pitchfork. What he does is he gets a mate of his called Ian Kelly to do the DNA test for him. Unfortunately for Colin, Ian then goes to the pub a few months later. And ironically, it's a pub just across the park from Alec's lab. And he mentions about how he's given a DNA sample on behalf of Colin Pitchfork. Somebody overhears it, goes to the police. They then go and raid Colin Pitchfork's house. And even as he's being arrested, he confesses to the crime. So most of our DNA is passed down like this. So you've got mom and dad, and you inherit half of your DNA from each of your parents. So this is very simplified, obviously. Now, mom and dad will also pass down half of their DNA to each child. Siblings share, on average, about half of their DNA. Now, the way we measure this sharing, and this will come up a little bit later, is a term known as a centimorgan. And we share, on average, about 3,500 centimorgans with each of our parents. Now, the problem is that as DNA is passed down through the generations, it's halving each time. So cousins, on average, will share about 12.5% of their DNA. Second cousins, I'll show you where these are, ta-da, share about 3% of their DNA in common. So DNA fingerprinting doesn't work very well. It doesn't work at all, really, as you start to go down through the generations that way. Now, different parts of our DNA are inherited differently. So we have got 23 pairs of chromosomes, and you get one half of each pair comes from mom, the other half comes from dad. We've got chromosome pairs number 1 to 22 are known as our autosomes, and they're the same between men and women. But we differ in our sex chromosomes. So we women have got 2 copies of this rather large X chromosome. Men have got an X chromosome, but they've also got this really titchy little Y chromosome. Now, what I like to say is size does not matter. It has a very important job to do. Now, it's got on it a gene known as SRY, sex-determining region Y. And basically, it's a gene that switches on at about 6 weeks gestation and sends the fetus down the path to becoming male. So it only goes down through the male line. There's another piece of DNA, so this is mitochondrial DNA, small circular piece of DNA. It's in the egg. So mums pass it down to all of their children, but only daughters can pass it on. So when I started in this field, I realized this is an awfully long time ago when I was putting this thing together, so nearly 30 years ago. What I was doing was I was looking at the Y chromosome, and these were in the days where we didn't really know about very many genetic markers on the Y chromosome, and I was looking at this and we were trying to tell Y chromosomes apart. So I started in the genetic genealogy field, essentially looking at the Y chromosome and surnames. So this is a sound cloud of some of the most common surnames in Britain. I bet some of you in here can spot a surname on there. Any of you got surnames on there? So Smith is the most common surname in the country. And surnames are passed down through the male line. So here's a guy, he gets together with a gal, they get married. Doesn't tend to be as much the case these days, but women used to change their surname on marriage. And then let's give them some kids. So here you've got a family group, and they're all going to have this chap's surname. So it's like a surname becomes like a shorthand for a biological relationship. And we do this. I mean, I don't know, but you was like, oh, I'm popping down the road to see such and such a family. This again shows you how old I am, because these are the sorts of names that I come up with when I think about this. But if you think about it, it's getting passed down through the generations, like this. And so it means that presumably all the chaps down here are going to have the same surname as this chap up here. So it's a bit like a dynasty. So evolution of paternally inherited surnames in Britain. Let's do a little quick history thing. So the Normans brought hereditary surnames to Britain. So we did have surnames, but they're now known as bynames. They weren't hereditary, and they can even change in your lifetime. Surname adoption was not a uniform process. So it tended to be that the wealthier families had them first, and then it gradually sort of filtered down to the rest of the population. It also happened earlier in the South than in the North in terms of adopting this practice of hereditary surnames. By 1350 AD, many families of various classes had surnames, and by 1500 AD, it's becoming rare not to have a surname. Now, looking at the 1881 census, which is what I was looking at when I was doing my PhD, there are over 400,000 surnames, but 45% of the population carries the most frequent 500 surnames. That leaves an awful lot of surnames still around, and it means that most surnames are rare. In fact, the average number of carriers for a particular surname is around 70. So most surnames are rare. So let's have a look at the types of them. So we have surnames that are based on personal names, usually a father's name, so like Thompson or Jeffries, but you do get matronymic, so based on women's names. You get occupational names like Smith or Baker. Now, Smith is the most common surname, and it's thought to originate from the occupation of blacksmith, and there would have been blacksmiths in every village. So when you see that people both have the surname Smith, like these two, and they're marrying one another, I'm not necessarily expecting them to be related because they both have the same surname. Now, you might joke, this is something I show to my students. In Iceland, they have done a huge family tree where nearly half the population has done as part of this giant family tree. So they now have this app for people that they can bump phones before they go any further with their relationship, just in case they're related. Locative, based on a place name, Titchmarsh, Attenborough. Topographical, so topographical feature of the landscape, so hill or Townsend. Nicknames, this is one of my favorite. Gifford, fat cheeks apparently. Relationship like cousins. And the other thing that you find is they can be highly geographically localized. So the surname Smith, you can find that all over the country. But so as you move down this frequency spectrum, what you tend to find is that you tend to find that certain surnames are found in particular parts of the country. So presumably where they originated or not too far away. So when I started my PhD, my thing was basically to look at surnames in the Y chromosome. And the question was, do all men who have the same surname, are they all related to one another? So Alec came to me because he had this long-running family story that he's related to Judge Jeffreys, not a very nice chap, known as the bloody judge or the hanging judge for his ruthless prosecution of those involved in the Monmouth Rebellion. But he's got this story that he's related to him. So do they have, say, Mr. Jeffrey as their ancestor? And if so, then you'd expect them to have an identical or near identical Y chromosome type. So that was essentially my PhD. Are all men alive today with a particular surname descended from an original Mr. Somebody with that surname? And if so, they should all have the same Y chromosome type. Well, we knew that that was unlikely to be the case because there's various complicating factors. Now, the first of these is multiple founders for a surname. You're going to have people called Mr. Smith all over the country. And they're going to pass down their surname and their Y chromosome type down to the next generation, and so on. Now, complicating things that come in are things like this, false paternity. So this is where the biological father is not the father that you think it is. So you've got somebody with the surname, but they've got a different Y chromosome type. You've got things like adoption, that's going to do a similar thing. You've got mutation that happens on the Y chromosome. So as the Y chromosome is being passed down through the generations, you get little typos in it, and that's fine, we know about those. We also get something known as drift, and I'll explain this on the next slide. But essentially, what's going to happen if I'm sampling randomly around the country and I'm getting people with particular surnames and I'm making sure that they're not closely related to one another? What are the sorts of Y chromosome types that I'm going to see? So drift comes into this quite a bit. So drift is best explained as the stochastic differences in the number of male offspring that a man will have. So here on the left, we have got the Bennett sisters. So this is Pride and Prejudice, and the story goes that Mr. and Mrs. Bennett keep on having children in the hopes of having a boy to whom they can leave their estate. As it is, they keep on having daughters. So just in this one generation, Mr. Bennett's surname and Y chromosome type have, what they say, daughtered out. One generation, gone. Then you have some people like this. This is Lionel. This is Lionel Felton. And the story goes that he and his wife kept on having children in the hopes of having a girl. When this photo was taken, they had 11 boys. I heard a rumor that they had 2 more children after this, both boys, and stopped. But as you can imagine, if I'm sampling Feltons around the country, I'm going to find an awful lot of Lionel Felton's Y chromosome type just by chance. So this was the big question. Is there a link between a Y chromosome type and a surname? And the answer is yes. Now, it really depends on the frequency of the surname. So what I did was an experiment where you go, okay, I'm going to take a whole bunch of controls. So these are men around the country. They've got over 100 different surnames. And I look at their Y chromosome types, and they all look different. And then I'm going to do the same for Smiths. I'm going to take Smiths all around the country and randomly, and I'm going to just look at their Y chromosome types. And again, it looks pretty much like the controls, and that's sort of what you would expect. But as you start to move down the frequency spectrum, you start to see something different. So you start to see that men are sharing Y chromosome types at quite high frequencies. So this is starting to link in that you've got a link between, it's stronger for the rarer names, not so much for the common names. David Attenborough, these guys were my poster boys, I tell you what. So I had David took part in this, and I had Attenborough's from around the country, so his spelling variant, but also the B-O-R-R-O-W spelling variant. And again, about 90% of them had identical or near identical Y chromosome types. And that's linking a Y chromosome type to the past. So an original Mr. Attenborough, who must have lived several hundred years ago. The maximum time depth we think for this is going to be around 700 years. And it's interesting because it links a Y chromosome type to a sort of a time and a place. So presumably where the surname originated or not too far away probably. So this led to an interesting question. Can you use this for forensic purposes? Can you go to a crime scene, pick up a DNA sample, you get type the Y chromosome from this, and then can you predict what somebody's surname was? So I did this. I did a kind of a thought exercise during my PhD, and I essentially made a database. I had pairs of men, all with the same surname, and I typed their Y chromosomes, and I split them in half. So this is my database. I've got all my surnames and the Y chromosomes, and these are my Y chromosomes that I'm finding at crime scenes. How often can you take a Y chromosome type and have it correctly predict what the surname will be? It was actually about 30% if you went down for the lower half of that link. So at the time, I mean, this is not going to be very good for very common names, and it wouldn't be feasible to have a database that would cover all of this. But it was extrapolated to, at the time, this is 2006, it's been superseded by now by quite a long way, to be of possible help in up to 70 rapes and murders per year. And that would be with a database of about 40,000 surnames. So what you would do is you would predict what the surname might be. You then are looking through your suspect list, or is this an unusual surname, that kind of thing. You might then go and talk to them first. So it's prioritizing your suspect list. You then have to use standard DNA profiling to rule out anything, to see if you've got a match. So it's investigative, it's not evidential. And the thinking was, well, maybe this will have a deterrent effect, because it doesn't have to be you on the database, just somebody with the same surname. Now, this did get used for some really interesting things. So this is back in 2005. There was a lad who was a sperm donor kid, and he knew he was a sperm donor kid, and he thought, okay, I'm going to go and get my Y chromosome tested at one of these testing companies. What he had was the date and place of birth of his sperm donor dad and the college degree information. That's all he had, but he didn't have a name. So he goes and gets his DNA tested with one of these testing companies, and it gets a match with two men who have got spelling variants of the same surname. So now he's got a surname, a possible surname. So then he goes on the internet and he is able to track down who that person is. So it's now the case, and we do this on DNA Family Secrets, and I'll chat a little bit about that in a little bit, but it's now the case that it's very, very difficult for people who thought they were going to be donating anonymously to remain anonymous because of these databases and because of these links. It led to some interesting little things that happened. So I was studying a relatively rare Yorkshire surname, and when we published the paper, we put it as R because it was quite rare, and we wanted to protect the privacy of people who took part. And what happened was I'd put a call out in Leicester, and I'd sort of said, would people like to take part in this study? I'm looking for anybody. So people would write in, and I'd send packs out, and they'd send me back their DNA, and I would test it. And this one person came back with a really unusual Y chromosome type. So one known as A1. So you get Y chromosome types that you find in particular parts of the world. This was a really unusual one. So it was only found in Northwest Africa. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I looked at other people with this surname, and 7 out of the 18 people that I sampled with this surname had this really unusual Y chromosome type. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. So brought him in, and he had absolutely no knowledge of any African ancestry in his family tree. So we got a genealogist called Jeff Swinfield, and what he did was he took the 7 men, and what he was able to do was to do 2 family trees. He was able to get them back to 1788 and 1789, but he couldn't join the 2 trees together. Now, they're all going back to Yorkshire. We know that we have things like a garrison of African soldiers who were guarding Hadrian's Wall. So that's a couple thousand years ago. But the most likely route that this Y chromosome type came to be in this country and associated with that particular surname is probably through the slave trade, just through the sheer number of individuals who were brought over here at the time. Now, as a geneticist, I'm not remotely surprised to see this. We all have very complex genetic ancestry, and this was something that was going to turn up at some point as you're doing population genetics in this country. But it was really interesting to see what happened in the press. So I'm a little PhD student, and I am being taken round to all of the various kind of news channels, including the Today program, in front of John Humphreys, who's trying to get me to say what the surname is, and he's going, is it Ramsbottom, is it this? And I'm like, can't tell you what this is. The Sun got rather kind of grumpy with us, and you'll see from this line, they said, Lester Boffins are not telling us what this surname is, but we've decided it must be Martin. So they haven't even clocked that maybe it might have started with an R, but anywho. At this point, though, I had been called a boffin. I didn't even have my PhD at this point, but I've been called a boffin, so as far as I was concerned, as a scientist, I had arrived. I've been called a boffin. This is the original John Revis. So the press was going absolutely bonkers, and I was calling him up saying, I think the press would really, really like to talk to you. And he was on holiday, bless him. So he comes back to sort of a couple of slightly frantic messages from me going, the press would really, really like to talk to you. So he did an exclusive with the Mail where they asked him really cringy questions like, so you have an African Y chromosome type. Do you feel like eating couscous or riding a camel? Oh, it was awful, awful. And then this came out. So Nick Griffin decided that there must be some agenda to it, and they thought that I might be black, for example, and there was some agenda to it. It was a really interesting thing to experience from this side, because you're going, as a geneticist, of course this is going to show up at some point, but it seemed to be something that sort of rattled people. Now, that's just looking at one piece of our DNA. So that's the Y chromosome that just goes back all the way through the male line. For Richard III, the case I worked on, I did do the Y chromosome, but I looked mainly at mitochondrial DNA. So let's have a look at the Richard case. So he is the last king of England to die in battle, and he died in the last main battle of the Wars of the Roses, and that was the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Now, we know that he is, from the historical records, we know a lot about what happened to him. We know that he's killed in battle, and he's brought back, and he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. Now, 1538, you get the dissolution of the monasteries. The friary is torn down, but the friary precinct has always been known, but the precise location of Richard's grave within that has been lost. So the project was actually initiated by this lady here. So this is Philippa Langley. And way back in 2011, she rang up Richard Buckley, who was the co-director of the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. And the way he tells us, he was on the phone for quite a long time to this lady, who was very interested in finding Richard III. And he got off the phone, he thought, well, we're really unlikely to find Richard III, but this would be a really interesting project to do in downtown Leicester. He's been excavating in downtown Leicester for over 30 years. And this is in an area which has been sort of relatively protected. And so he thinks, well, this would be an interesting project to do. And he gets a hold of Richard Taylor, who was the deputy registrar at the time. So Philippa comes up to the university in spring of 2011, and Richard Taylor says, yep, we will absolutely help you. We will give you resources. We will give you money towards the excavation. And actually, a number of different people contributed to the excavation. So we had people from the Richard III Society. So someone else who had pledged money at one point then pulled out some of the money. So Philippa led a whip round where they found money. So for the excavation, it was paid overwhelmingly by the University of Leicester, so not just the excavation, but all the post-excavation, because obviously what you can't do is dig all this stuff up and then just shove it in a room. You have to do the post-ex, and that was all paid for by the University of Leicester. So June 2011, I got an email from Richard Buckley. He's starting to assemble his team. And it basically says, we're going to be looking for the remains of somebody who's quite famous, who's buried in downtown Leicester, and I can't tell you who it is. So I wrote back going, is this Richard III? Because my aunt had, when I first got to this country, the first thing she did was she took me out to Bosworth Battlefield, and she'd lent me loads of books about Richard III. So I'm going, hang on, is this Richard? And he writes back going, yes, but don't tell anybody. Don't worry, we're never going to find him. It'll be half a day of your time, max. It was a long time ago. It's been anything but that. So I come on over a year before the excavation starts, and he's starting to assemble his team. So you've got Matthew Morris, who's the fieldwork director, Joe Appleby, who was our osteologist on the project, Kevin Schurer, who led on the genealogy side, people like Sarah Hainsworth, who did the forensic engineering, and a lot of the images you'll see were done by this chap. So this is Carl Vivian, who was the video producer at the time. So it was this really lovely project that involved a massive partnership between all sorts of people to bring it all together to do. And it was really lovely to be involved in. And the other thing I really like, so this is a slide that I've been showing since about 2012. All of the science was led by women. I really like that. Exactly. So Richard III, what are we looking for? Okay, so we know he's in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. He's age 32 when he died, and he died in battle. So we may be finding a skeleton with battle injuries on it. But you can, of course, die in battle and have no injuries on your remains because you could have just bled to death. But we're expecting possibly somebody with battle injuries. Possibly a hunchback with a slight build, and a lot of this is laid at Shakespeare's door. So Shakespeare gives him like a little gammy leg and, withered arm, just for good measure, calls him a bunchback toad. So are we going to find somebody who's got a hunchback? So you have to actually go back. So Shakespeare's writing over 100 years after Richard died. You actually have to go back to the original sources, and there's two that talk about what he looked like. Now, you've got John Rouse, who talks about him having a short face and unequal shoulders, the right higher and the left lower, so possibly a spinal abnormality. And then you've got Nicholas von Popplau, who I love Nicholas, right? So he is apparently an itinerant Silesian knight visiting England. So to me, that sounds like a kid on a gap year. He's come over. And he talks about how Richard is 3 fingers taller than he is, but then doesn't tell you how tall he is, so you can't work out how tall Richard would have been. But talks about him being lightly built, slender arms and thighs, and a great heart. So this is, nearly a year later, after I got pulled onto the project, this is the day before the dig started. And we put out a little press thing, and we thought, who's going to be interested in this? Well, it turned out lots and lots of people. And the other thing was that Philip had brought in the Channel 4 film crew. So they were doing a documentary about it. So we had all these cameras here, and they're like filming the archaeologists as they're laying out the trench, and they're like following them as they do all these like little bits. And all of these kind of cars, the big vans start turning up, with all the satellite dishes on, all this kind of stuff. And the one place that they didn't film was where Richard was, because they parked right on top of the poor guy.
Today, we are starting the search here at Greyfriars for the remains of King Richard III, who there is evidence that suggests is buried somewhere under this car park.
The possibility
John
of
Ashdown
finding
Hill from the Richard III
Richard's
Society.
grave, Richard's tomb, is it's chance.
This is the first search for an English anointed king, and here we are in a car park underneath which could be one of the most important historical figures in English history.
Well, I wouldn't say that
Michael
I've done any
Ibsen.
research. He was buried in the vicinity. The question is, are his bones still here?
I'm optimistic. If we find a skeleton, there are new techniques that will allow us to get DNA out. We hope.
Well, we'll be doing
Richard
well
Buckley.
if we find the lines of walls and floors that relate to the friary buildings. That's the great expectation.
And I think it's all about
Philippa.
getting real on Richard. Whether we find Richard, whether we don't find Richard. For me, this project was all about the looking for Richard.
Cautiously optimistic, I'd say.
But even if we don't find Richard's remains, it will still be a tremendously exciting fortnight.
That was the day before the dig started. As you can tell, none of us knew what was coming. So this is the first really detailed map of Leicester. It's Thomas Roberts' map. It's from 1741, and it actually shows on it the Greyfriars. So this is not the Greyfriars Friary. It's the land that the Greyfriars used to be on, and it's been bought and then later split up and this sort of thing, and there's now car parks and things on it. But what archaeologists regularly do is they look at old maps and they overlay them with modern ordnance survey maps. This gives us a search area. So in here, these are all buildings. Here's a car park. There's a car park. There's another. So that's the Alderman Newton School playground. And we've only got, this is the Friary Precinct, we've only got about 17% of the precinct is available to us, and we've only got the money to do 1%. And it's decided to put 2 long, thin trenches here in the social services car park. And Richard III is rather famous for having supposedly killed his nephews to be able to take the throne. And this was the social services car park for child protection. Couldn't make it up. So also, contrary to what you might have heard, again, I've been using this slide for 10 years. Contrary to what you might have heard, R did not mark the spot. It was the first day of the excavation. We're like, oh yeah, there's an R in the car park. We'll go straight down. He's going to be there. He wasn't. He was about where Carl was taking this photo. So he's about a bay and a half up. That's where he was. Almost under the R, not quite. So this is the 25th of August 2012, 527 years to the day when Richard is supposed to have been buried here, if you don't mind the calendar changeover. And the trenches start going in, and we find this little bit of leg bone. Now, you cannot just start excavating skeletons willy-nilly. You have to get a license to lift remains, and you have to get it from the Ministry of Justice. And we say to the Ministry of Justice, okay, we've got the money. What we're going to do is we will lift up to 6 sets of remains. But we're not going to do the first 6 we find. We have to make educated decisions as to which ones we're going to go for. And we still don't know where we are in the friary. So we know Richard's supposed to be in the choir. So what we need to do is keep excavating so we can get ourselves a little map so we can hone in on where we want to be. So we start excavating and we find the remains of robbed out walls. So we're finding little bits of the friary. We're finding what looks like benches, and that's giving us an indication as to where we might be. We're getting what looks like a cloistral walk, a lovely little walkway with a step down. And that's starting to orientate us and tell us that we think we found the friary. So this was our little update that went out. Relatively little to report right now. Richard III's still dead. But we're really excited because we think we found a building that's medieval in date. And this is where we think we are. So these are the car parks. There's trench 1. There's our little skeleton we found on the first day. We've left it covered. There's trench 2. Looks like we found the chapter house. We know Richard's in the church. Now, if we've got friaries have got a standard layout. So we found these big, thick walls. We think, could this be the church? Let's put another trench in and see if we can find this church. And we'll put it here, over on the other side of that wall. And pretty quickly, it looks like we've come down on the presbytery end. So we've got 2 very thick walls. We've got a massive stone coffin, which we found on the very last day, and we probably would have thought that was Richard if we'd found it on the first day, and choir stall footing. And that means that where we found that little bit of leg on the very first day is down at the other end of the choir. So we'll go and have a look at it. And that's what we find. So we have a youngish male, severe battle injuries, severe scoliosis of the spine, in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars. Is it him? So this is where you have to get a number of specialists on board who come and do the work. So what we're finding is that the location is right. This is a male. It's an aged about 30 to 34. He's got severe scoliosis of the spine, battle injuries, stable isotope data is coming back, radioisotope data is coming back. It's all fitting, this being Richard. Now, in this day and age, you can add DNA evidence to the pot, and that completely relies on being able to find relatives to compare the DNA to. Now, Richard left no known living descendants, and not just any old relative will do. And that's because of the way our DNA is inherited. Our DNA is a very complex mixture of that of our many ancestors. I need to use those 2 pieces of DNA, Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. So we need to find people who are related in this particular way. Now, Richard, it's thought, there's going to be between 1 and 17 million people alive today who are descended from Richard's immediate family. And I can tell you, it feels like most of them have emailed me by now. But I need people who are related in that particular way. So it needs to be either an all-male line or an all-female line. I can do Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. Now, male line, relatives of Richard III, this is really easy to do. You go to Burke's Peerage. So you have to go up the tree, across to Edward III, down through John of Gaunt, until you get down to this chap. So this is Henry Somerset, and he's the 5th Duke of Beaufort. And what we were able to do was to trace 5 living descendants who are supposedly, through an all-male line, related to Richard, except for that one tiny possible problem, and that is because the biological father might not be the father that you think it is. So if any sort of medieval hanky-panky has gone on and somebody else has come onto the scene, these men may have the Y chromosome type of somebody who's not the recorded father. And we know of 2 instances where children are born out of wedlock and later legitimized, but if anything else has happened, there won't be a DNA match. Female line, so we already knew about this chap. So this is Michael Ibsen. And he had been found by John Ashdown Hill and a group who he was working with. So their family tree was already known in a number of sources, including the Reuben roll. But what John Ashdown Hill and his team were able to do was to take it down those last few generations. They found Joy Ibsen, who'd sadly passed away a few years previously, but Michael will have inherited his mitochondrial DNA type from his mom. Now, we wanted to see if we could find more than one person, and this is where Kevin Schur and his team came in, and they found this lady, Wendy Duldig. Duldig. Are you kidding me? That surname. Anything but a Duldig. She and Michael are 14th cousins twice removed through the female line. So what I'm expecting is that they will have identical or near identical mitochondrial DNA types, and that should match the skeleton if it's Richard. So this is just some of the work I did because it would be way too long to actually put on a slide. But this is part of the DNA sequence that's coming back from the mitochondrial DNA of Michael Ibsen. And what you're interested in here is not the heights of those peaks, but the sequence of those 4 different colors, because those 4 different colors are the 4 different building blocks of DNA. So that's Michael, that's Wendy, and that's skeleton 1, the one we found on the very first day of the excavation. So the DNA as well is pointing to these being the remains of Richard. Male line was slightly different. Now, here's our 5 living descendants of Henry. There wasn't a DNA match, and in fact, there must be at least 2 false paternity events, and one of them was recent. So I had to go and chat to them. There's a story behind that, but I don't have time. So basically, it turned out they knew there might be an illegitimacy in the family tree, but they hadn't said anything. So that's fine. Phew, sort that one out. The other 4, they match. That's telling me that is Henry Somerset's Y chromosome type, but it doesn't match the remains. Now, I'm not worried, and as a geneticist, I know this is happening about 1% to 2% per generation. It doesn't affect the overall identification. Even with this, it's still coming back as 99.99999% that these are the remains of Richard. So I'm not particularly worried, but the press went a little bit bananas, and the reason for that is that we don't know where it's happened, but if it's in this part of the tree, could that have affected the claim to the throne of the Yorkist Plantagenet kings? In here, you start to affect the Lancastrian Plantagenet kings anywhere in these 2 generations, and you're starting to affect the Tudors. So when we published the paper, we thought this is really interesting. We don't know where it is, but it's interesting because it could have had an impact on the historical monarchy. And the press went bananas. Oh my goodness, I spent about a month doing interviews all over the world, saying, no, we don't know where this is. It doesn't affect the Queen. Definitely not on the Christmas card list. It doesn't affect the Queen for 2 reasons. One, we don't know where it is. Second of all, it's not a straight line from the Tudors straight down to Lizzie anyways, and now King Charles. So, but still, this is what the press did. Benedict came to the reinterment, and at the time he was filming The Hollow Crown, so he's filming about Richard III at the time, and he's actually related to Richard III through a couple of routes. Sadly, not in a way that I could sidle up to him and say, hi, can I get a DNA sample? Unfortunately. 2 people who are also related but weren't invited were Hillary and Donald. And then some of you might have seen this lovely pro, Danny Dyer, oh bless him, he was so excited. So if you've seen the Who Do You Think You Are episode, he finds out that he's descended from Edward III. And here's me shouting at the television. So here he is, people are going, so hey, have royalty been in touch with you? He's like, no, they're blanking me. But the thing is we know that the number of descendants that Edward III had, Adam Rutherford, who's a friend of mine who's lovely, has done a kind of back of the envelope calculation and has worked out that the chances of somebody with broadly British ancestry not being descended from Edward III is a ridiculously tiny number. Things have moved on somewhat. So how many of you have had your DNA tested with one of the big 4 testing companies? Yeah, it's very, very popular. So things have really moved on. So we don't do DNA fingerprinting like we used to do for this kind of thing. What they're doing is they are testing, they're typing essentially several 100,000 bits of your DNA. And then they do things where they kind of go, okay, so where are we getting matches for your DNA in particular parts of the world? And then they give you this breakdown of kind of where you're getting your matches. And it can say something about your ancestry. And the other thing it does is it will give you people who you're matching and tell you how much DNA you share with them. So those centimorgans again. So for example, here you've got 346 centimorgans. It doesn't tell you precisely how you're related to somebody, but it gives you an indication. You need to get other bits of information like how old is this person, that kind of thing. Could it be at that amount of DNA sharing? Could it be a first cousin? Could it be a first cousin once removed? This kind of thing. So this is really useful. So this slide, this whole thing about DNA fingerprinting didn't work past a couple of generations. Now we can look at things where we do this sort of testing and we can see people who are second cousins, third cousins, this kind of thing. So this has now been used in cases where it's called investigative genetic genealogy. So this is where you can do things like identify John and Jane Doe, so unidentified individuals, using DNA like this, and also track perpetrators. So these are kind of 2 quite famous cases. This is the buckskin girl. So she was found in 1981, named the buckskin girl because she had this rather distinctive coat on. And what they did was a few years ago is they thought, okay, we're going to try using this method, basically like what they do with Ancestry and 23andMe in terms of typing a number of different markers. And they uploaded that to a DNA database, and they got a hit. Now, this is a fantastic site by Johnny Pearl. It's called DNA Painter. And if you put that in, the amount of sharing that you get, it'll give you an indication of what are the possible relationships. And they knew how old this girl was likely to be. And then they start to look at this match that they get, and they kind of go, okay, so judging from how old this person is, you can probably guess that might be a first cousin or a first cousin once removed. Start building the tree out. And what they did was they then found that this person had a relative who was missing. So now they are able to give this lady a name, and this has all been done through the DNA Doe project. Another case, this is quite a famous case, so this is the Golden State Killer case. So this was a series of rapes and murders that went on in California. They started with burglaries, then rapes, then murders, and then they suddenly stopped. But what they did was they went back and revisited this case again. So this was done by a woman called Barbara Ray Ventnor, and they uploaded the DNA to these DNA databases, and they started getting a number of different matches of possible relatives. And I'll show you how they work this out. They were able to trace it to this chap. So this is Joseph James D'Angelo. So what do? You get DNA matches, and this is rather simplified, but this is basically how it works. So you get DNA matches, and you start to build family trees. And then you start to see that some of these trees start to connect, and they were able to go back to a set of great-great-great-grandparents. So you know the perpetrator has descended from this set of great-great-grandparents. So who are these people? You start to work your way back down again. And then what you can do is you start to look, okay, so the perpetrator's male, so we're interested in looking at the females, but you can start to narrow down, too old, right place, that sort of thing, even things like using hair and eye color. And then that can help you home in on who the perpetrator might be. And this is exactly the sort of stuff that we do with DNA Family Secrets. So this is the program that I do with Stacey Dooley. And we tend to get 3 main questions that people come to us with. So one might be, I'm adopted, I don't know who my parents are. We get people who are donor conceived, and they want to know if they've got any half siblings or whether or not we can find their biological parent for them. Or it could be something where, and this happens quite a lot, people go, well, I just found out that my biological father isn't the person I thought it was. So I would like to find out who that is. So these are the 3 kind of main questions that people come to us with. The other thing they might have is if they don't know what their ancestry is, for example. So we've had people who have taken part where they go, I don't know who my biological father is, and I think I might be mixed race, and I don't know what my ancestry is. And so the other thing you can do is you can help somebody with that, understand about where they're getting matches in the world and where their biological parent might have been from. So again, this is a very similar thing to what we do all the time. This is a case that I did for somebody. So quietly in the background, what I often do is help people for free. So they will email me and say, look, I need some help, and I'll have a look at their stuff for them. So what happens is you go, right, okay, you know who your mom is. We're going to partition out your matches. I'm not interested in those. You want to find out who your biological father is. So what you start to do is build trees. This is a chap who didn't know who his biological father was. This was really easy because the matches were so close. And you start to build up the trees, and you start to see that these two families intersect in a marriage. So your person is matching these people. He's descended from that marriage. And this was a really easy one to do because they'd had mainly daughters and one son. So solve that one. That was a pretty quick one to do. So we are now filming series 3. I think we might still be looking for the odd person to take part. So if you are interested, I get to work with this amazing lady here. So this is Stacey Dooley. And the question I always get asked is she as lovely on TV as she is in real life? Yes, she is. She's lovely. And there's a really lovely team behind it. So alongside all of this, and people don't necessarily, they won't have this necessarily if they're doing it on their own, is we've got counselors and all these sorts of people behind. We've got genealogists working on it, me working on it, production team, all this kind of stuff. So there's a massive amount of support that goes into helping people with this. And finally, I thought I would let you know the results of this particular thing. So do you remember Alec thought he might be related to Judge Jeffreys? Well, I happened to have somebody in my set who could trace his line all the way back to Judge Jeffreys. So I did a Y chromosome test of the two of them, and there wasn't a DNA match. So Alec was quite bummed about that, and he's pretty sure that it must be because there was a false paternity in that guy's line, and that he is actually related. And there you go, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it.